Good morning. This is Ron. It is Saturday, March 31st. Welcome to Story Time. Today, Chapter 13 of Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy, Who Needs It? The Stimulus and the Response, written in 1972. The Stimulus. There are occasions when a worthless, insignificant book acquires significance as a scrap of litmus paper exposing a culture's intellectual state. Such a book is Beyond Freedom and Dignity by B.F. Skinner. Skinner is the most influential of living American psychologists, says Time magazine, September 20, 1971. Quote, Skinner has remained a highly influential figure among U.S. college students for well over a decade, unquote, says Newsweek, September 20, 1971. Quote, Burrhus Frederick Skinner is the most influential psychologist alive today, and he is second only to Freud as the most important psychologist of all time. This, at least, is the feeling of 56% of the members of the American Psychological Association who were polled on the question. And it should be reason enough to make Dr. Skinner's new book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, one of the most important happenings in the 20th century psychology, unquote, says Science News, August 7th, 1971. One cannot evaluate the cultural significance of such a statement until one identifies the nature of their object. The book itself is like Boris Karloff's embodiment of Frankenstein's monster, a corpse patched with nuts, bolts, and screws from a junkyard of philosophy. Pragmatism, social Darwinism, positivism, linguistic analysis, with some nails by Hume, threads by Russell, and glue by the New York Post. The book's voice, like Karloff's, is an emission of inarticulate, moaning growls, directed at a special enemy, autonomous man. Autonomous man is the term used by Mr. Skinner to denote man's consciousness in all those aspects which distinguish it from the sensory level of an animal's consciousness, specifically reason, mind, values, concepts, thought, judgment, volition, purpose, memory, independence, self-esteem. These, he asserts, do not exist. They are an illusion, a myth, a, quote, pre-scientific, unquote, superstition. His term may be taken to include everything we call, quote, man's inner world, unquote, except that Mr. Skinner would never allow such an expression. Whenever he has to refer to man's inner world, he says, quote, inside your skin, unquote. Quote, inside his skin, unquote, man is totally determined by his environment and by his genetic endowment, which was determined by his ancestors' environment, Mr. Skinner asserts, and totally malleable. By controlling the environment, quote, behavioral technologists, unquote, could and should control men inside out. If people were brought to give up individual autonomy and to join Mr. Skinner in proclaiming, quote, to man qua man we readily say, good riddance, unquote, page 201. The behavioral technologists would create a new species and a perfect world. This is the book's thesis. One expects that an assertion of this kind would be supported by some demonstration or indication of the methods these technologists will use in order to manipulate those non-autonomous bipeds. Curiously enough, there is no such indication in the book. I may be flattering Mr. Skinner, but it occurred to me that perhaps the book itself was intended to be a demonstration of the methods he envisions. There are certain conditions which the book requires of its readers. A, being out of focus. B, skimming. C, self-doubt. D, the premise, when confronted with outrageous absurdity, quote, I don't get it, but he must have reasons for saying it, unquote. These conditions will bring the reader to miss the main ingredients of the book's epistemological method, which are 1. Equivocation, 2. Substituting metaphors for proof and examples for definitions. 3. Setting up and knocking down straw men. 4. Mentioning a given notion is controversial, following it up with 2 or 3 pages of irrelevant small talk, then mentioning it again and treating it as if it had been proved. 5. Raising valid questions to indicate that the author is aware of them, and, by the same technique, leaving them unanswered. 6. Overtalking and overloading the reader's consciousness with over-elaborate discussions of trivia. Then smuggling in enormous essentials without discussion, as if they were incontrovertible. 7. Assuming an authoritarian tone to enunciate dogmatic absolutes, and the more dubious the absolute, the more authoritarian the tone. 8. Providing a brief summary at the end of each chapter, which summary includes, as if they had been proved, notions not included or barely mentioned in the chapter's text. All of this, and more, is done grossly, crudely, obviously, which leaves the book pockmarked with gaping craters of contradictions, like a moon landscape, and as lifelessly dull. In Atlas Shrugged, I discuss 2 variants of mysticism, the mystics of spirit and the mystics of muscle. Quote, those who believe in consciousness without existence, and those who believe in existence without consciousness. Both demand the surrender of your mind, one to their revelations, the other to their reflexes. I said that their aims are alike. Quote, in matter, the enslavement of man's body, in spirit, the destruction of man's mind, unquote. Mr. Skinner is a mystic of muscle, so extreme, complete, all out a mystic of muscle, that one could not use him in fiction. He sounds like a caricature. At the start of his book, what he demands of his readers is faith. Quote, in what follows, these issues are discussed from a scientific point of view, but this does not mean that the reader will need to know the details of a scientific analysis of behavior. A mere interpretation will suffice. The instances of behavior cited in what follows are not offered as proof of the interpretation. The proof is to be found in the basic analysis. The principles used in interpreting the instances have a plausibility which would be lacking in principles drawn entirely from causal or casual observation, unquote. This means the proof of Mr. Skinner's theory is inaccessible to laymen, who must take him on faith, substituting plausibility for logic. If his, quote, interpretation, unquote, sounds plausible, it means that he has valid, i.e., non-casual, reasons for expounding it. This is offered as scientific epistemology. It must be noted that Mr. Skinner's interpretations of the, quote, scientific analysis of behavior are rejected by a great many experts initiated into higher mysteries, not only by psychiatrists and by psychologists of different schools, but even by his own fellow behaviorists. As a cover against criticism, Mr. Skinner resorts to the mystic's usual scapegoat, language. Quote, the text will often seem inconsistent. English, like all languages, is full of pre-scientific terms, but the issues are important to the non-specialist and need to be discussed in a non-technical fashion, unquote. Pages 23 and 24. The mystics of spirit accuse language of being, quote, materialistic, unquote. Mr. Skinner accuses it of being, quote, mentalistic, unquote. Both regard their own theories as ineffable, i.e., incommunicable in language. Many psychologists are envious of the prestige and the achievements of the physical sciences, which they try not to emulate, but to imitate. Mr. Skinner is archetypal in this respect. He is passionately intent on being accepted as a scientist and complains that only, quote, autonomous man, unquote, stands in the way of such acceptance, which I am sure is true. Mr. Skinner points out scornfully that primitive men who were unable to see the difference between living beings and inanimate objects ascribed the objects' motions to conscious gods or demons, and that science could not begin until this belief was discarded. In the name of science, Mr. Skinner switches defiantly to the other side of the same basic coin. Accepting the belief that consciousness is supernatural, he refuses to accept the existence of man's mind. All human behavior, he asserts, is the product of a process called, quote, operant conditioning, unquote, and all the functions we ascribe to, quote, autonomous man, unquote, are performed by a single agent called a reinforcer. In view of the omnipotence ascribed to this agent throughout the book, a definition would have been very helpful. But here is all we get. Quote, when a bit of behavior is followed by a certain kind of consequence, it is more likely to occur again, and a consequence having this effect is called a reinforcer. Food, for example, is a reinforcer to a hungry organism. Anything the organism does that is followed by the receipt of food is more likely to be done again whenever the organism is hungry. Negative reinforcers are called aversive in the same sense. They are the things organisms turn away from. Page 27. If you assume this means that a, quote, reinforcer, unquote, is something which causes pleasure or pain, you'll be wrong, because on page 107, Mr. Skinner declares, there is no important causal connection between the reinforcing effect of a stimulus and the feelings to which it gives rise. What is maximized or minimized, or what is ultimately good or bad, are things, not feelings, and men work to achieve them or to avoid them not because of the way they feel, but because they are positive or negative reinforcers. Then by what means or process do these reinforcers affect man's actions? In the whole of the book, no answer is given. And that's part 1 of chapter 13, called The Stimulus and the Response. And one of the things that I wanted to note here, Ayn Rand quotes some of the accolades that Mr. Skinner is getting, such as, Skinner is the most influential of living American psychologists, Time magazine. Skinner has remained a highly influential figure among U.S. college students for well over a decade, Newsweek. Burris Frederick Skinner is the most influential psychologist alive today, and he is second only to Freud as the most important psychologist of all time. This at least is the feeling of 6% of the members of the American Psychological Association who were polled on the question. And it should be reason enough to make Dr. Skinner's new book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, one of the most important happenings in 20th century psychology, says Science News. None of those statements are declarative. None of those statements are definitive or are dispositive in terms of the real question you're looking to have answered about this book before you read it is it valid? Are the conclusions that Mr. Skinner has drawn valid? Is Mr. Skinner speaking the truth? And all of these, when you skim over these accolades, it seems as though they have the ring of people that approve, of the ring of approval, basically, and that's all they really do. None of these really come out and make a dry conclusion, except almost the one that says that he is the most influential psychologist alive today, second only to Freud, is the most important psychologist of all time, and then we find out that is because of a poll. It wasn't a conclusion that was actually drawn by Science News itself. So, again, all these accolades, we don't know that they've actually read the book. We don't know that they've actually read anything that Mr. Skinner has done. We don't know that they even really know who the hell Mr. Skinner is. For all we know, Mr. Skinner may have paid these people for these accolades. This may be just sheer advertising. He gives them a few bucks. They write up a little blurb saying, wow, I love his hair. Wow, I love the way he stands in the doorway. He's so influential. College students really eat him up. What does that say? What does that prove? Does that say that he has really made a point? He has come up with some kind of idea or ideas that no one else has, and that are not only right, but that are essential, vital, important. And we don't know. Those statements say nothing of the sort. They're very political statements. They're statements that, again, have the vibration, the feeling of approval. But when you read them and think about them, you realize that they're bland. They're nothing. And Ayn Rand missed that. She's using this to say, because again, she's saying that this book is a barometer of the intellectual state of a particular society, in this case, the United States in 1972. But she's wrong. Also, you have to remember that if you're a doctor, I don't care if you're a doctor of medicine, psychology, psychiatry, philosophy, whatever, If you want to make an impact in your field, you don't go out and just write a book for the consumption by the general public. That's not what's going to do it. You write about specific things and you submit them to journals. If you're a philosopher, then you submit it to a philosophy journal. If you are a psychologist, it goes to a psychological journal. There is a journal for medicine called the Journal of the American Medical Association, and that's where you submit medical studies. You've done certain studies, you've come up with a new discovery, maybe for a cure, or maybe you found a new disease, or something of that nature, new treatment, whatever. That's the place that you go if what you want is to be taken seriously by your peers, by the medical community, or in other publications by the psychological community, philosophical community, etc. This book that Mr. Skinner did isn't in a journal. It's published. He published it on his own, and it is directed to regular people, regular folks like you and I. And part of the reason that he's going to do that, or what I assume that he's doing, is he's sending it to you and me to bypass review by his peers, because he is concerned or knows that his peers will disapprove of, criticize, and perhaps prove that his methods and therefore his ideas are invalid. So he bypasses them, sends them directly to you and me, and you and I, we don't know. We don't, unless we've had some schooling or education in psychology, how would we know what's valid or not valid? And again, if as Ayn Rand says, he doesn't supply any proofs, he doesn't supply any evidence. He basically just says, uses the oldest fallacy in the book, which is take my word for it. And since he is a psychologist and I'm not, I am therefore, at least theoretically, easily intimidated. I'm just going to go ahead and go along with it. And then his ideas will gain popularity. Because again, this goes back to subjectivist metaphysics, the idea that everything is psychological in nature, all of life, and that what is right or wrong or good or bad is doesn't exist. That what does exist is everything is basically equal in terms of ideas, other than its popularity. That's the only difference between particular ideas, is their popularity. And the ideas that are most popular are the ones that are real and will be treated as real, and that's really what's important. Not to describe reality, but to create realities, and that you do that by creating popularity. You create a consensus. There's a saying that what's among subjectivists that what's real is whatever the majority says is real. And we see a lot of that in art. What's art? What's not art? Well, if a majority of people, particularly a majority of art critics, say something is a piece of art, and we're kind of stuck with it. And so same thing here goes with Mr. Skinner, where he just basically tells the lay people, you and I, take my word for it. You don't know as much as I do about psychology, so you're going to have to take my word for it. And then hope that the book strikes a chord and becomes popular with the lay people and becomes influential throughout society because of that. So tomorrow it will be part 2 of Chapter 13, The Stimulus and the Response. Until then, thank you very much for joining me, and have a great day.